Okay. Oh, shocked myself. Good afternoon, everybody. I just shocked myself awake, so already an exciting caucus here. I'd like to welcome everybody to the Rare Disease Congressional Caucus briefing. The topic that we'll be discussing today is securing progress, PDUFA's role in rare disease drug development. My name is Carter Esham. I am CEO of Esham Strategies. I also serve as, in part of that capacity, as the Executive Director for the Alliance for a Stronger FDA, and I will be your MC today. I have had over, Annie, 20 plus years of health policy experience in DC, including serving as lead negotiator for PDUFA 6 and 7 on behalf of the Biotechnology Trade Innovation Organization. We would like to give a special thanks to our Congressional Caucus members, Senators Wicker and Klobuchar, and Representative Matsui and Belarakis. So thank them and anybody from their teams, we thank you. We'd also like to thank the rare disease community for sponsoring this event. You can see the wonderful sponsors on the slide there. I'm looking around to see if any of the members are here. Not seeing anyone, we'll proceed. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to give a brief overview of PDUFA, just for any of those that might be a bit new to the process. I'm going to introduce our speakers, and then we'll get right into a panel discussion, and hopefully have some time. We'll leave some time for a Q&A from you all as well. All right? So our speakers today are, to my left, the illustrious Annie Kennedy, who is the Chief Policy, Advocacy, and Patient Engagement at the Every Life Foundation for Rare Diseases. She is a friend and well-respected person to all in the rare disease community. She has been at Every Life Foundation since 2018 and led numerous community-driven evidence development efforts, including the National Economic Burden of Rare Disease Study. She previously held leadership roles at both the Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy and Muscular Dystrophy Association, where she led landmark community-driven efforts, including the MD Care Act and the Patient-Focused Impact Assessment, which became the patient experience data provision that was enacted as part of 21st Century Cures. And again, as someone who's known Annie for a long time, there's no one more respected or hardworking than she. I'd also like to introduce Miro Pasternak, who is the Chief Strategy Officer of Rare Disease Research, which is a multi-site platform conducting rare disease clinical trials, including cell and gene therapies trials. He has played a key role in building Gooseberry Research and Devesa Health. He has more than 17 years' experience in clinical research innovation, biotechnology business development, and investment management. He also holds a PhD in molecular and cell biology from UC Berkeley and organizes the annual Rare Trials Summit. Thank you, Mira. And lastly, but not least, we have Sean Chang, who joined the National Health Council in 2023. He brings over a dozen years of public policy, regulatory, and government relations experience to the role. His career included roles at the Infectious Disease Society of America, working on antimicrobial resistance to Zika, the National Community Pharmacists Association, where they coordinated federal regulatory response during COVID. Most recently, the Sepsis Alliance, where he established the nation's first multi-stakeholder coalition focused on prevention and treatment of patients with sepsis. So I think we're all in for a very productive conversation this morning. I've already introduced myself. So just a brief overview of PDUFA. So it was first enacted in 1992, and it was a result of a lot of growing concerns that it was just taking too long to develop and review drugs, and that it was not meeting, those timelines were not meeting public health needs, and were preventing people from access to improved care in a timely fashion. So what was realized is, in order to fix the problem, significant resources and funding were going to be required. So they determined that the regulated industry should pay fees, application fees and fees, to support resources and funding for the human drug review activities. But there are limitations and there are guardrails, and I want to make sure that we all understand what those are. So the technical agreement, or commitment letter, that's the slang used, is an agreement reached between the FDA and the regulated industry, represented by the trade organizations, bio and pharma in this case. That agreement cannot set regulatory policy, so it cannot set regulatory policy. The agreement, the technical agreement, must be enacted and passed by Congress, and the agreements only last for 5 years. There's also a funding sort of safeguard where there's what they call a trigger, that there's a required amount of funding that has to be provided by appropriations for the purposes of human drug review. So if that trigger gets tricked, if there's not enough appropriations versus user fees, they actually cannot collect the user fee. So it's a pretty important again, it's meant to be a safeguard to make sure that both government and the regulatory industry are part of funding these activities. What it can do is do things like set goals for meeting timelines. It can provide resources for a set number of FTEs, full-time equivalents, which are basically employees and employees' time spent for certain activities, like for patient-focused drug development, or overall for CEDAR, it can set overall resource staffing levels, as well as, again, meeting timelines, review timelines. The vehicle that happens every 5 years whereby this commitment letter has to be enacted is an opportunity to set regulatory improvements via the legislative process. You can see here, I just did a brief slide where you can kind of see how the program has evolved over time. I'll just do a couple highlights. Obviously, PDUFA 1 in 1992 set the fees, really kind of addressed the backlog, started the concept of thinking through what should review timelines look like. PDUFA 2 kind of refined that argument. They begin to adding things like meeting management. So again, like when should meetings occur, what conversations need to occur there to make sure that those timelines can be met. You can have a timeline all day long, but if you're not having the right conversations at the right time, it won't work. 3 and 4 is where you really started to see some funding and resources being provided for safety activities, including post-monitoring surveillance activities, risk evaluation mitigation strategies. PDUFA 5 is where we really saw the advancement of the concept of patient-focused drug development. That was really where, that was not saying the conversation was new, but it was where it became part of the technical user fee negotiations, where specific resources were funded for people with expertise in patient-focused drug development, and it funded those voice of the patient meetings, if you all remember those, that really started, that was a result of PDUFA 5, where we all learned that what we thought we knew what patients needed, that we did not actually know what patients needed or wanted and prioritized. So that was a really important moment in time for the patient community, generally speaking. PDUFA 5 also began to look at issues like biomarker qualification processes. So again, very important to those that dependent on accelerated approval, surrogate endpoint approvals, et cetera. 6 is where we really took that patient-focused drug development concept, and what you tried to see is a systematic integration of patient perspective data included into drug submissions and making sure that the FDA had the resources and expertise. We're providing guidance to the communities about how those things will be, can be collected in a way that can be usable for the purposes of approval of new medicines. It also was an attempt to try to reestablish how the program was financed, to bring some more stability to the FDA about how to predict year-over-year funds, and an attempt, albeit not entirely successful, to prevent like huge increases year over year. This is where you saw the funding change to 20% of the funds coming from application fees and 80% coming from fees charged to products that are on the market. So again, if a product is on the market, they have to pay the FDA so that they can continue to do work to review drugs and also monitor drugs that are on the market. PDUFA 7, there was a real focus again on data. So again, taking that perspective data and then really thinking about how are we collecting it, what are the tools we're collecting it by. This is where we started to see that the FDA was in desperate need of resources and expertise to be able to evaluate real-world evidence, to have cloud technologies to collect, be able to get that information in a secure way that is easy for them to review and look at and analyze. So there was a lot of work on sort of cloud technologies, IT modernization, to help that sort of modern approach to evidence generation and review. There was also a focus on looking at drug development meeting management. So again, there was new meetings created to allow for complex conversations to happen earlier in the process, focus on those complex issues with the idea that anything you can do to have early issue identification and resolution, the better off we all are. And so that leads us now to PDUFA 8, which is underway. So just quickly, for those that don't know, this is sort of the timeline, and this is where we are in the environment. It's about a 2-year process, so you're always in some cycle of PDUFA negotiations almost. As soon as you're halfway through the last one, you're going right into technical negotiations. So right now, we're in the second bar here, November 25th. Usually this starts September, so I do note that it started a couple of months later this year, but we have no reason to think that the goal is still not to have the technical agreement from FDA and companies reach by March. Then it goes through a very detailed clearance process through the administration, which takes about a year. And then in 2027, we begin the legislative process. So that's where we are in the process. That is my overview. And with that, I'm going to turn over to Annie for her presentation, and then we'll go Miro and Sean, and then we'll open up the panel.
Thanks so much, Heather.
Did I not do that right? This slide's frozen.
Maybe.
Technical support. Seriously, does anybody know how to advance the slides? Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe we can talk without slides. Here, I'll try it this way.
There you go.
There we go. Okay. There's always a way. All right. So that was a great overview of PDUFA. Thank you all for being here today. One of the things we're really excited about today is to frame this through the lens of opportunities for patient community engagement. And more specifically, how our rare disease community, so two of us here are speaking on behalf of the rare disease community, and then we're really honored to have the National Health Council here speaking on our broader community's lens. As Carter said, the goal of PDUFA was to figure out how to shorten product review timelines. The reason PDUFA happened was because during the HIV/AIDS epidemic, the HIV community activated and said it is unacceptable that we have so many people dying and we have so many products being developed outside the US, and there has to be another way. And so, as many of us know, the history was that the HIV community came together and shut down the FDA and activated. And this was the result, that FDA, Congress, and the community came together, the patient community came together and said, okay, we're going to find another way. We're going to do this differently. And so the Prescription Drug User Fee Act was the result of those discussions and that collaboration. And so it's really fitting that we come together and think about how patient communities have an opportunity to insert our vision into these negotiations. Now, Carter also talked about the fact that really the negotiators right now are the regulated trade, bio and pharma, and FDA. And then once they've completed their negotiations, they bring that commitment to Congress. But it is really important to say that all of those entities do engage with our patient communities and are actually required to do that, and also go beyond their requirements in talking to us and working with us. And so this is our opportunity to be meeting with all of you and sharing with you at this point what the priorities of the communities who are engaging together are for PDUFA. We also simultaneously, prior to the start of negotiations, many of us were working with bio and pharma and sharing our priorities with them. And then there's an ongoing engagement with the FDA that you should be aware of. And FDA has public stakeholder meetings with patient advocacy organizations that have expressed an interest in participating in the process, and those are monthly engagements, the next of which is actually tomorrow. So I have a timeline that sort of matches alongside Carter's timeline, and you'll note that my timeline picks up at PDUFA 5, because we are the Every Life Foundation for Rare Diseases, and it was PDUFA 5 that actually leaned into rare disease. And so while there was PDUFA 1, 2, 3, and 4 prior to that, at PDUFA 5, that's when really the negotiations started to lean into how could we innovate related to rare disease therapeutic development. And so I'm just going to expand a little bit on some of what Carter talked about, what was happening related to innovation. And there are some of us in this room that were a part of those discussions at that time. So Carter already talked about PDUFA 5 was really the birth of patient-focused drug development. And I know many of us in this room work on patient-focused drug development and transforming that moment into a movement. And we've really been thrilled to see that expand. So it's more than just the workshops, the internally and externally led workshops. It's really been the expansion of how we transform patient experience into data and incorporate that into clinical trials and decision-making. But that it was also the birth of the breakthrough designation pathway. It's also where the accelerated approval pathway was first expanded to application in rare disease therapeutic development. Also, very timely for this work is where the pediatric priority review voucher was expanded to application in rare disease, which is a very hot topic right now. Thank you to the House of Representatives this week, and we're pushing that momentum over to the Senate. And then also the benefit risk framework was established in PDUFA 5. So PDUFA 5 was an incredibly important moment and the beginning of, as I said, a movement for the rare disease community. Now, 21st Century Cures Act was not PDUFA, but I put it here on this timeline because it was passed into law in December of 2016, which was closely aligned with PDUFA 6. And the themes and what happened within 21st Century Cures were closely aligned with much of what was happening in PDUFA 6. So I just want to highlight some of what came from 21st Century Cures with direct application, and that were really closely aligned with what had come from PDUFA 5 and building on that momentum into PDUFA 6. So that's where the patient experience data checklist, or the inclusion of patient experience data in product review, came from. Actually, I was with Janet Woodcock and the FDA commissioner the day that they were going over to the White House for the bill signing for 21st Century Cures, and Janet Woodcock made the observation that the signing of that bill would be the codification of patient experience and PFDD as a part of FDA's mission when that was being signed into law. So that was incredibly important that day. The expanded access policy and the integration of real-world evidence came from 21st Century Cures. And again, you're going to see that continue to be pulled through in PDUFA 6. PDUFA 6, for those of you who were here at the time, will remember that was referred to as a skinny PDUFA, there was smaller amount of, or fewer priorities in that bill, but all clearly still incredibly important. Again, strengthening PFDD, focus on real-world evidence, and clinical trial innovation, a lot of focus on adaptive trial design there. And then PDUFA 7, which is actually what we're in, so I have the years where PDUFA extends, and as Carter pointed out, we're really always in a PDUFA cycle, even while we're negotiating the next PDUFA, was a lot of emphasis on rare disease, a lot of pilots within the FDA focused on how we can innovate within rare disease. Also a pull-through from CDER, where a lot of these activities had typically happened, into CBER. And that was incredibly important to our communities as well. So at the Early Life Foundation, we are a coalition. We are a coalition of patient advocacy organizations and biopharmaceutical industry partners focused on rare disease. And so we have been working with the community to identify what the shared priorities are as we look to PDUFA 8. And so there is a copy of those priorities in that letter on the back table, and then you can find it on our website as well. If, like me, you don't like to walk around with a lot of paper. But I'm just going to highlight a couple of them right now. And you'll see it says early priorities, because we're continuing to work with our partners to refine these and build these out. We actually have an ongoing working group talking through these. And if you or your offices are interested in learning more about this, or actually talking to some of the patient communities and partners who have direct experience with any of these issues, we would be happy to help facilitate that as well. So our first one is we have been very grateful for those pilot programs that have come from PDUFA 7. We would like to see those be expanded on. We also, though, would like to learn more from what has come from them. We would like to see some of the case studies and the learnings from those be shared and disseminated. We are hearing from some of the industry partners that there's just not necessarily a lot even known about what came from those case studies. So before we can even build upon it, we need to learn more from it. We want to, of course, evolve patient-focused drug development. Patient-focused drug development is working. But we want to make sure that it's not just a single point in time engagement, but it's an entire pathway for opportunities for engagement within the agency. Also, within PDUFA 7, it was marked with more transparency and more consistency, but we, as a community, and should be familiar if you've heard us speak before, we are always calling for more transparency and more consistency, and we continue to do that in PDUFA 8. We are especially interested in opportunities that will enable more transparency into what data is informing decision-making in regulatory review that will lend itself to quicker, faster, broader eligibility and decision-making within the access environment. We also have been supporting the creation of a new mechanism called the Science-Focused Drug Development Meeting Mechanism. There's actually legislation called the Expert Act that's being led by Representative Matsui, and I see their office here. If you're interested in that, you can see Jackie. But this would be not to take the place of patient-focused drug development meetings, but this would be convenings that would help resolve targeted scientific questions that are not product-specific, but that are pipeline-specific, that would help move entire pipelines forward, where FDA and the disease community or scientific community could then come to agreement and help move the pipeline forward. For more information on that, see the Expert Act or see Jackie in the back. And then we're also very interested in establishing opportunities for earlier payer engagement. There's a model within CDRH that we would love to see be adapted by CDER and CBER. And then finally, innovations in post-market data collection, so that as innovative products are being approved, we can be facilitating patient and provider decision-making and have more information in that post-market setting to help ensure safety, help ensure decision-making, and ensure that the broadest population possible has access to those therapies. All right, thank you so much.
Thank you, Annie. Sean? Oh, sorry, Miro, yeah.
Hi, everyone. Well, thank you for the invitation to be here. First, I would like to thank Dr. Han Fan of Rare Disease Research, who created the Rare Trial Summit as a venue for rare disease clinical development. And then I also would like to thank Pat Furlong of PPMD, and who had the idea to create a workshop on PDUFA 8 at the Rare Trial Summit that we held in September. And then Annie Kennedy, who moderated the workshop and provided leadership. So we convened a group of about 40 leaders in rare disease clinical development. We're listed here from advocacy, biotech, CROs. These are mostly practitioners of rare disease clinical research who are sort of on the receiving end of PDUFA, if you will. Different backgrounds, different incentives, but we came to the same conclusions. We agreed on 3 priorities for rare disease clinical development under PDUFA 8. So if there are 3 things that I would like everyone to remember today, these would be the following priorities. We start with priority 1, transparency. So, everyone deserves to know what evidence actually counts in FDA reviews. Families, organizations invest years in building natural history data, functional measures, patient experience documentation, and then the review letter often comes back and just states, patient input was considered. Considered how? What does that mean? Did it change the benefit risk assessment? Did it affect the labeling? So, there's a very simple fix to that. We would ask to require 1 short section in every benefit risk assessment explaining how patient experience data and real-world evidence informed the FDA decisions. Just state what mattered and why. Basically, we're asking for a simple box on a form that could close the loop, eliminate wasted work, and help build fit-for-purpose data the first time around. Transparency speeds up drug development, and this is probably the least costly and most meaningful reform we can make right now. The second thing we agreed on was the need for capacity and continuity. Rare disease expertise shouldn't leave the FDA every time the staff rotates. A recent example is a neurological rare disease sponsor who faced 4 different review teams in the process of seeking approval for their therapy, and then each new team had to basically relearn the disease. So it's not a reviewer failure, it's a continuity of knowledge failure. And so rare disease science is too specialized to rely on personal memory. FDA needs institutional knowledge. And so some of the proposed solutions from our PDUFA workshop included a recommendation to build a functional knowledge management system so that precedents don't vanish, resource the Rare Disease Innovation Hub, create specialized training pathways for rare disease reviewers, ensure structured exposure to patient experience data, and formalize reviewer participation in PFDD meetings. And so we're not asking to change the standards, we're asking to retain knowledge at the FDA. Every other high complexity industry uses institutional memory for safety and efficiency, and rare diseases should too. And our third priority that came out of our workshop is the need for structured engagement with the FDA. So when regulators understand patient lived experience, drug development accelerates. A recent example in spinal muscular atrophy, progress in clinical development of new therapies showed the power of aligned perspectives between patients, clinicians, trial sponsors, and regulators on disease progression and meaningful improvement for patients. So when, in many other diseases, that sort of alignment is missing, and this misalignment costs time, money, and sometimes lives. And so some of the solutions proposed by our workshop included, first and foremost, limited follow-up calls after milestone meetings so that a single question doesn't trigger a pre-IND restart or full new cycle. Just simple, communications. Formalize reviewer engagement in PFDD meetings and scientific forums, expand RISE workshops, particularly for ultra-small populations facing unique challenges, and then allow flexibility in natural history as natural history evolves, which it often does in rare diseases. This keeps the standards intact. The goal is simply to have a shared understanding of scientific problems that we're solving. And in closing, I would just like to say that although these 3 priorities focused on rare disease, these improvements modernize PDUFA, strengthen evidence-based care, and reinforce U.S. leadership in biomedical innovation. Across all 5 working groups that we had in our workshop, we agreed on these 3 priorities: transparency, continuity of knowledge, and structured engagement. These are the strongest levers for accelerating safe and effective rare disease therapies. These are operational improvements. They strengthen the FDA, reduce unpredictability, and shorten the time between diagnosis and actionable treatment. For many families, that gap is still a lifetime. PDUFA 8 can embed these reforms with literally just a few sentences incorporated. 30 million Americans with rare diseases are depending on us to get this right. I'd like to thank everyone for your time and commitment. The printed copies of our workshop recommendations are outside on a table available for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. Sean?
Hi, good afternoon, folks. Sean Chang, the Senior Director of Policy and Regulatory Affairs at the National Health Council. Appreciate the invitation here. So the NHC represents a little over 180 national health organizations, including patient and caregiver organizations representing people living with chronic diseases, rare conditions, genetic disorders, and disabilities, groups that often generate early scientific evidence, such as natural history information that Mira was referring to, as well as real-world patient experiences. Our members also include research and provider organizations that generate clinical evidence and care for people with rare diseases, as well as biopharmaceutical device, diagnostic, and digital health companies that are committed to developing therapies and tools for these communities. Because of this broad membership, the NHC sees the full arc of what it takes for a rare disease therapy to move from concept to approval. And across that entire arc, from natural history work to trial design to regulatory review, one theme consistently emerges, which is FDA's ability to evaluate rare disease therapies depends heavily on staffing and infrastructure supported through PDUFA. And I think what you've been hearing is that PDUFA is foundational to how therapies are reviewed today, but there are also some pretty clear limits on what it can support. So understanding what those limits are is essential as we look forward to PDUFA 8. Carter grounded us all in what PDUFA is, why it's important, but I wanted to touch base a little bit on the clear statutory limits of PDUFA. So user fees can support review activities, so that's evaluating applications, meeting performance goals. What it cannot do is be used to build new scientific standards, develop methodological guidance, or create the tools that modern rare disease trials increasingly rely on. So this distinction is quite important. So PDUFA ensures that FDA can review what is submitted, but what it cannot do is ensure that the right tools exist in the first place. So that brings us to the next slide, which are some modernization priorities that the NHC has moving into PDUFA 8. Now, this is not in contrast to the priorities that you've heard from Annie or Miro. This is additive. Transparency is something that we've heard consistently and the NHC fully supports. But I wanted to touch base a little bit on some different aspects in terms of what the NHC sees as some priorities. So digital health technologies, which includes wearables, sensors, mobile apps, at-home monitors, the tools that collect continuous health information outside of clinic visits. So to use these in regulatory decisions, FDA needs standards for these for validation, reliability, context of use, as well as, so just to ground those terms a little bit, so validation, does the tool measure what it intends to measure? Reliability, does it measure it consistently? And the context of use is what regulatory purpose the measure is acceptable for. Real-world data, real-world evidence refers to the health information that's collected outside of clinical trials. So electronic health records, insurance claims, patient registry, caregiver reports, digital tools, and real-world evidence is the clinical evidence generated from analyzing those data. So that evidence is essential when rare diseases cannot support large randomized trials. Externally controlled trials, ECTs, these are trials where instead of a randomized control group, the comparison group comes from either natural history studies, which is systematic data on disease progression without treatment, historical trial data, or real-world data sets. So what FDA needs for these priorities is acceptance criteria for when an external control is reliable, matching methods, which are statistical techniques that align treated and comparison groups, and sensitivity analyses, which are tests showing results held under different assumptions. And lastly, something that the NHC has been championing for some time are patient-centered core outcome sets, which are standardized sets of outcomes and endpoints that all trials in a particular disease should collect because they reflect what patients and caregivers say matter most. So those build on clinical outcome assessments, which are the tools that measure symptoms or functioning. Those are patient-reported or clinician-reported, caregiver-observed, or performance-based. Endpoints, which are how those measures are used to evaluate treatment benefit in a trial. And then a related term, which is patient-centered core impact sets, which are the lists of symptoms and burdens and life impacts that patients and caregivers identify as most meaningful. So the core impact sets define lived impacts, and the core outcome sets define how those impacts are measured. So the core outcome sets translate the priorities captured into consistent and usable evidence, improving comparability across trials and ensuring that FDA clinicians, payers, and families can interpret those results in a meaningful way. So on the previous slide, I highlighted what scientific tools rare disease programs need to succeed, which are digital endpoints, real-world evidence standards, clear criteria for externally controlled trials, patient-centered core outcome sets. But none of those modernization activities can be funded or authorized through user fees alone. So PDUFA can support review work, but it can't build the scientific standards that modern rare disease development requires. Now that authority rests with Congress. So past PDUFA cycles are a strong model for what congressional leadership can achieve, right? So we've heard about what our earlier reauthorizations did, which is strengthen FDA's rare disease expertise, improving that early scientific dialogue through those FDA developer meetings like pre-INDs, Type B milestone meetings, and Type C scientific meetings, as well as establishing the PFDD framework, as well as laying the groundwork for today's digital, as well as RWE tools through pilots and infrastructure. So those congressional actions helped build the rare disease review system that we depend on today. So just as prior PDUFA cycles created the last generation of rare disease infrastructure, PDUFA 8 is a moment for Congress to enable the next one. So I think, Annie, you said, I wanted to write it down, but I missed it. So you said something about it was a moment that turned into a movement. And so that's what we're looking at now. So rare disease science is advancing rapidly. And I think at this point, patient and caregiver priorities are relatively well understood. But what's not kept pace is the regulatory infrastructure that Congress now has an opportunity to ensure that the rare disease development are fully supported and that families benefit from that innovation without unnecessary delay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. All right, we have time. I'm going to ask a few questions, and then we'll leave a few minutes to take some questions from the audience. So I'll start sort of with a high-level question. As you reflect back on like past PDUFAs, what do you think? What have they done to actually make things better? And perhaps simultaneously, as we're looking forward, reflecting, maybe add a few extra points on some of the things that you raised during your talks about what do we need to see improve. And I'll give an example like pilot programs. Again, the RDA pilot program, the real-world evidence pilot program. We all know those were intended to allow processes, to test some concepts out, figure out how they work, and then the idea is that then reviewers will be trained upon those findings, the community will be informed by those findings to really move things forward. So I'll start with you, Andy, maybe reflect back on like what have been some key things that have really made a difference, and then maybe elaborate on some things you think are really going to be important to improve moving forward. Oh, yes.
We're sharing.
Yeah.
Sharing is
Well,
caring.
I guess that's
Carter.
all it is. There you go. Yeah. Get closer to me,
Is
yeah.
it stuck? All right. We're going to get really cozy
There you
over
go,
here. Well, I think one of the things that we maybe haven't even said yet, but if we have, we're going to double down on it, is to emphasize that the way that PDUFA is supported is not through taxpayer dollars, but is through what are considered user fees. So they're fees paid by industry at key time points during the development program. So I think that's incredibly important when we talk about this program, is that this isn't a program supported by taxpayers. It's a way to offset the work and the need for resources at FDA with funds supported directly by industry. So I think that's really incredibly important. The other thing is PDUFA just celebrated its 33rd birthday last month, I believe. And when I think about that timeline slide that I put up, and many of the infrastructure that have come from PDUFA, there are people that I know and love who are alive today because of that infrastructure, because of the accelerated approval program, because of the benefit risk framework, because of the way that we now collect patient experience data, because of the use of real-world evidence, because of digital health technologies, because of adaptive trials. The other thing that I don't think any of us mentioned is that, and I'll go back to at the beginning, how this all started. When all of this started, more than 70% of products were developed outside the US first. And that flipped after PDUFA. And that is no longer the case, which is incredibly important right now in the context of therapeutic development. So that's a big win and something that we want to make sure we underscore as a reason to herald PDUFA. But the other thing that happened is that we knew that PDUFA was working because in the first years after PDUFA passed, we saw an influx of products be developed and approved here in the US. So I believe it was 25 products in the first couple years after PDUFA were able to swiftly move through. And review timelines went from an average of 27 months that it took to review a product to it came down to, I believe it was 16 months at that time.
Now it's 10 and 6, yeah.
And now it's 10 and 6. So we know that it works. The other thing that recently happened that we know is another win is that when we just had the shutdown, the medical product division was still functioning at 80% capacity because of the user fees. Because those roles, as Carter just talked about, many of those individuals and many of those functions were supported through user fees, not through taxpayer dollars. So those roles and those functions through moving medical products through were still happening. So to your question of what would we point to, how would we know, almost everything up on those slides as far as the history is what I would point to as wins. And so when we think about opportunities for innovation, the fact that this is must pass in and of itself is a win. And we're just talking about how do we continue to build on that success. That in this climate is a huge win and something we should all be really proud of.
I think the pressure's on, fellas. That may have been the best answer of the positive impact that PDUFA has had, but I'll turn it over to you, Miro, and then you, Sean. Same question.
I would say I would agree with Annie. I wouldn't have any additional comments on it.
Sean, any additional?
Yep, it's already on, okay. No, I don't think so. I think that was pretty comprehensive. You know, PDUFA created the capacity and the touch points and the frameworks that allow rare disease therapies to really be reviewed at all. So I think, you know, PDUFA 8 is about kind of building the scientific standards that will allow that system to mature.
Thank you. It was a really good answer, Annie. The next question I'd like to have you all reflect on, again, as you all mentioned in your talks, you know, there is a process. The trade associations are currently in negotiations with FDA, and Annie, you touched on this specifically in your talk, is where there are opportunities for the patient community and the patient perspective to assert their priorities and influence the outcomes, not just of the technical agreement, but also working collaboratively across the ecosystem for the upcoming legislative vehicle. If you could reflect on sort of what you've seen work really well, and maybe where there's also areas of improvement. And again, I'll start with you, Annie.
Does someone else want to start first? Okay, I'll start. I did talk a little bit about how we have been engaging. I will say it has, over the years, this has changed. This is something that has evolved. I think there are two things. One thing, I think that this is one of those areas that is very technical. So for a lot of patient communities probably don't even necessarily understand the impact and importance of PDUFA. So many of our coalition organizations work very hard to build awareness around the importance of engaging. So I know National Health Council does work around this. We do work around this. And just the example of RDR convening a workshop around this to make sure that as many stakeholders can be informing the discussions before they begin is incredibly important, so that the input that's being brought forward into those engagements is as representative of the broader community's experience as possible is incredibly important to all of us. And then I just want to commend and give a shout out to the regulated trades and to FDA for the fact that they do reach out and proactively work to engage our communities so that there are opportunities for us to be engaging with them so that when they are getting to the negotiating table, they have an understanding of what we're prioritizing, and that to the degree that they're able to, there is some discussion. It is worth saying, though, that once those negotiations start, they are not able to continue talking to us and keeping those lines of engagement open. But we do then have that mechanism to be engaging with FDA. I also should mention that FDA does post the meeting minutes from their discussions with industry. And the meeting minutes from the November discussions between FDA and industry went on FDA's website on Monday. So the November meeting minutes and all those engagements are on FDA's website right now. So if that's something you're interested in, all of that detail is on the FDA PDUFA 8 website. So again, over time, additional transparency has been bolted into this process. And then our ability to be communicating directly with elected officials and with Congress to make sure that you're aware of what the community's priorities are, because ultimately the FDA commitment letter will come to the Hill and will come to Congress. And so we're really grateful that you're here in the room hearing from us.
Sean, from an NHC perspective, anything to add to that in terms of how you're engaging collaboratively with stakeholders?
So not so much about our engagement with our membership with other patient organizations, but I will say that overall engagement it's improved significantly over the different cycles, but it does remain relatively episodic. And inconsistent, and particularly for rare disease communities, it can be quite burdensome for the patients and for the caregivers themselves. So while the PFDD meetings were certainly transformative, because rare disease populations are and are quite small by definition, and also frequently geographically dispersed, I think what we're seeing is that they can't continue to supply the same input repeatedly, which is kind of where that patient-centered core outcome set comes into play. So that's something that would be structural, and it's not so much procedural. So that would be something that would be repeatable, and it would take and convert those patient and caregiver priorities into something that's standardized, that all drug sponsors that they can rely on. So that would hopefully reduce the burden on families and caregivers, and then increase that consistency across trials, and also improve interpretability for FDA and for payers. So,
And Mary, you mentioned in your talk that you had this rare disease workshop. Maybe it'd be helpful for people in the audience to know who attended that workshop and where might they be able to find that report. Might be very, I think, interesting to the audience.
Yeah, so the Rare Trial Summit we did the first one in September at about 250 attendees, and a quarter of them were patient advocacy leaders. More than half were clinical stage rare disease biopharmaceutical company representatives, primarily in clinical development, but some in regulatory, and then some in commercial and market access roles. And so that was really sort of the workshop on PDUFA 8 that we did was really my first exposure to PDUFA. But I would say probably a third of the people in the room, if I'm right, Annie, would be patient advocacy leaders. And so there's great interest, and I think we're going to see an increased patient voice in the regulatory process, just as we see increased patient advocacy participation in clinical development itself. So just from a practitioner's perspective, we run rare disease clinical trials at Rare Disease Research, and our relationships with patient advocacy organizations in the indications in which we run trials are getting stronger every year, both because patient advocacy groups are getting more educated about how to do clinical research. The patients and families themselves become more educated about clinical research, and also because we need patients to participating in clinical trials. And really provide input on patient-lived experiences as early as during trial design with the clinical trial sponsors. So if that answers your question.
Yes, thank you for that. And I think we're about ready we're going to wrap, I think, a few minutes early, but we'll all be hanging around, so if you all have questions, you can feel free to come up and ask us. So I'll just ask each panelist maybe just to give their closing statement, and I think for myself personally, I think what you've heard today is how critical this program is. It is the user fee program is an opportunity to, again, continue to support an infrastructure that's vitally important. It's an opportunity to improve processes and operational aspects of that program. It also sets the stage for a legislative cycle that allow us to really think about how to continue to modernize, streamline, and improve the development of medicines that can really change the lives of patients and their families, particularly in the rare disease community. But any closing comment?
Well, I feel like I've said a lot, but I'll just end with, we're here to be a resource to you. So as Carter has mentioned, this is an ongoing cycle, and this is a process. And please turn to the Every Life Foundation as the process continues. So thank you for being here today.
Closing comments from Sean?
We've heard today just the tremendous progress that's been made already through previous PDUFA cycles. So what's needed is congressional action is needed so that we can sustain that and modernize that infrastructure for continued progress for rare disease patients and their families. And thanks for the opportunity to be here. And then NHC is also available as a resource. Anytime, please feel free to reach out to myself or my legislative colleague, Jen Dexter, at the National Health Council at any time. Yeah, happy to be here.
Mira, last words?
The report we talked about is available on raretrialsummit.com if there are no copies left outside. But, thank you for the opportunity to be here.
Well, thank you for such an esteemed panel. Thank you all for coming today, and I wish you early happy holidays. But we'll be around if anybody has any questions. Thank you.
We're going to do it.
We're doing
Should we go by the flag?
For sure. I think we're going to do a picture by the flag, gentlemen.